everyone, my name is Rafi and I wanted to give a review of my newest bike, the Salsa Blackthorn. Now you might look at it and go, hey, I think that's the Salsa Cassidy, and you'd be right too. So Salsa has two bikes in their lineup, the Blackthorn and the Cassidy, that actually share this frame. The only difference is these two pieces right here, the shock yoke and the rear link pivot. You can switch those out yourself, and if you swap out the shock and the fork, as well as those two pieces, you can switch between the two. So today I'm going to talk about the Blackthorn setup, and I'm going to post separate videos talking about how it does as the Cassidy and what it takes to swap between the two. So the Blackthorn really fits my everyday trail riding. So I'm here in the Vietnam Trail Network in Milford, Massachusetts, which is fairly chunky, fairly technical, lots of big rocks, rollers, roots everywhere. And this fits my normal everyday riding style. It's fairly pedalable, but certainly burly enough to get me over any of the features here. Now the Salsa Cassidy, which again I'll review separately, is what I'd use more for a bike park day, or if I ever decide to take on an enduro race, that's what I'm gonna be using in that situation. So the Salsa Blackthorn is stock, a 140 rear, 160 front, kind of heavy duty all mountain or trail bike. Now Salsa gives you some options where you can make it a little more versatile. So the way I have mine set up, I actually have 145 millimeters of travel in the rear, thanks to using a 55 millimeter stroke length shock. And they also give you the option to run a 150 millimeter fork in the front instead of 160 if you want, you know, a little more agility, a little more of that forward position, a little more pedalability. Now, pretty much any Salsa full suspension bike is going to use what they call split pivot suspension system in the rear. It's a system that Dave Weigel designed, which was enough to convince me that it was worth a try. And on that note, my point of reference when I'm talking about this bike, you know, in terms of any comparisons I'm going to make, are to the Ibis Ripmo AF, right? Another bike that has a Dave Weigel design in the rear, the DW link, and that's the bike that I was riding for about a year and a half or two before I switched to this bike. When I made the switch, I pretty much swapped over all of my parts. So the wheel set is the same, my drivetrain and brakes are the same, the cockpit is the same, even my DVO suspension setup is the same as it was on the Ripmo. So I feel, you know, any comparisons are fairly apples to apples in terms of how this feels compared to the Ibis Ripmo AF that I've been riding. So just a little bit on exactly how I have my personal Blackthorn set up, right? So clearly I'm using the Cassidy frame. I have DVO suspension front and rear. I really liked how it performed on the Ibis, and so I wanted to carry it over here. In fact, I brought the physical fork over from the Ibis Ripmo to this bike, and I purchased a new DVO Topaz rear shock, which I've been incredibly happy with. The wheels are probably the biggest upgrade that I've done on this bike. So these are Evil Loopholes, which are Industry 9 Hydra hubs on Evil's loophole rims. Essentially an enduro level carbon rim. I've been incredibly happy with them, and in this environment where there are tons of big impacts, sharp rocks, nasty roots, they have performed incredibly. Otherwise, I tend to trust Shimano SLX for pretty much all my drivetrain and braking needs. The only thing I insist on is an XT shifter. I find that it completely changes how the shifting feels, whereas, you know, the rear derailleur, the cassette, not such a big deal in terms of, you know, everyday ride experience, but that shifter makes a huge difference. And lastly, I have some Trail One components up front. I have their carbon handlebar and their nice short aluminum stem. Let's start with how the bike descends. And that's one area where I've been pretty pleasantly surprised by this bike. Not that it should be a surprise that it performs well, but it has really exceeded my expectations. So it has a fairly long wheelbase, relatively slack head angle, but very short chain stays. So it's incredibly confident when pointed downhill, but that short chainstay really gives you the ability to maneuver around things as needed. And the way the rear suspension performs, that split pivot design in conjunction with the DVO Topaz, the small bump sensitivity is unlike anything I've ever felt before. It absolutely eats up chunk on the way down. It feels so stable and so confident that it really allows me to progress. It allows me to trust the bike to go faster. The other brilliant thing that I think makes it a really good descender is the frame. The frame is super stiff. I can definitely feel a difference in how sturdy and how burly that frame feels compared to the Ripmo AF. This bike is carbon, this bike is super boost, right? So it's clearly built to be burly, but you can feel that when you're going down, whether that's in a straight line or over chunk. It's confident. Where you tell it to go, you can be confident it's gonna go. It doesn't give any sort of noodly feeling. It's just a precision machine. The other place that stiff frame comes in handy is cornering. The stiff frame in conjunction with the short chainstays means when you want to whip around a corner, whether it's flat or bermed, you can get the bike to do exactly what you want. If you need to move your rear end out of the way to slide around an obstacle, no problem. If you just want to lean into a corner and really trust that bike, it's got your back. Now, let's talk about jumping a little bit. So jumping is not something that I'm necessarily an expert at, but it's something that I'm working on, right? And this bike, it kind of just feels smooth. I think because that rear end is relatively supple, it allows me to take jumps with confidence. It doesn't feel sketchy on takeoffs. It just smooths everything out from takeoff to landing, and it feels relatively maneuverable in the air as well. I feel like some other bikes that I've tried to jump on, they can be a little bit more jittery. They just don't handle weird takeoffs as well, and this thing just feels stable, confident, sturdy when I'm putting it in the air. Now, to compare this to the Ripmo in terms of descending, I mean, the Ripmo is known for that DW link being supportive, being poppy, being playful. This rear end definitely feels a little more damped, right? That it's more eager to use up a little bit more of its travel, especially early. And so I think this bike feels much more confident on descents, whereas the Ripmo maybe would be more supportive. So I have found that the Ripmo in sort of smooth situations, right, like well machine built trails, or maybe more of the trails that are out west that are a little bit smoother, the Ripmo might feel a little more supportive, whereas this on sort of any technical descending I feel gives me much more confidence. It just eats everything up and lets me not worry about it. So how does it do on the climbs, right? Now, initially when I got this bike, again, to compare it to the Ripmo, I've already said that the small bump compliance, right, and the rear end on this are definitely a little bit softer than the Ripmo. So the Ripmo certainly excels, especially when climbing smooth trails. It's far more supportive, it's far more efficient. But one thing that really surprised me was that when I'm climbing technical trails like there are here, right, there's not a lot of smooth stuff in the Massachusetts area. The small bump compliance of this bike actually really smooths out the climb. So any technical climbing, I found that there's a huge advantage on this bike. The traction just feels completely unwavering, right? It allows you to focus on what's ahead of you. Sometimes on the Ripmo, if I was climbing and I would hit, a rock maybe this size, I would feel the bike really kind of buck, maybe a little bit harshly. And this absolutely doesn't do that. So the trade-off, of course, between the smooth climbing and the technical climbing, I really feel that this bike excels at the technical climbing, whereas the Ripmo I would trust more on the fire road. Now, this shock has a pedal switch and a climb switch, which I think to me kind of neutralize that issue. And so for climbing in this area, I actually think this bike is phenomenal. Now, the short chainstays, again, they do allow you to sort of maneuver the front end around as needed. So if you're coming up, let's say, a tight and twisty, maybe technical bit of single track, right? The long wheelbase can feel a little bit cumbersome, but that short end allows you to lift the front wheel up and place it exactly where you need it. So again, a little bit of a trade-off, but once you're used to the bike, I haven't found any issue on the extra tight stuff that we have around here, especially when climbing. A couple other notes just on my experience riding this bike. So it does have a flip chip. It's integrated into the rear shock mount at the yoke. So it has a high and low setting. I'll let you look up the geometry charts for yourself. It doesn't change the geometry by that much, but surprisingly, I found that I really like running this bike in the high position. I never thought that would be the case, right? I mean, why would you get a 145, 160 mil bike just to run it in the high position. But I've found that it gives me just that little bit of extra maneuverability, a tiny bit of help avoiding pedal strikes. The i9 Hydra hubs certainly help with that as well. But yeah, I don't know. I've found that it's just more comfortable for me, a better all-arounder in terms of pedaling with that flip chip in the high position. To end off, I'll kind of just do some, top pros and maybe a few of the cons. So the biggest things about this bike that I really love, the first is that it's two bikes in one, right? I mean, you have to get a different suspension setup in that link, and you have to spend, it takes me about an hour to swap in between. But having those two bikes in one, for me, is a huge plus. The second thing is going to be that climbing traction. That it really changed the game for me here at our local trails. I was super impressed by how it handles technical climbing. The third thing, it's stable. I mean, that burly, stiff frame comes with a little bit of a weight penalty, but it is incredibly confident pointed down, and it's allowing me to progress fantastically. And lastly, the storage on the bike personally is a little bit better than what I was finding on the Ripmo. I can fit a full-size 30-ounce water bottle down in the water bottle cage, and it has the integrated strap for a tube, so I absolutely love those things. As far as any cons that I have with this bike, the first is just that maybe it's a little bit heavy. That's the price you pay, I think, for burliness a little. I've chosen, I think, to make it more tough than light, and I'm okay with that. And really the only other con to me is the fact that it's Super Boost, which, isn't that big of a deal, but it's just something to consider, if you're looking into this bike. So that wraps up my review of the Salsa Blackthorn. Again, I'll be posting a separate review of it in Cassidy format, and I'll be posting a separate video of how I swap in between the two, which takes me about an hour. So yeah, thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions. Ride safe.